Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in for another episode. Today I've got a really good tip for you that goes oftentimes very overlooked by the average angler, and it makes a huge difference. Now, before I share this with you, I do want to remind you though that I've got a members only channel. If you're looking for more tips like this, more content from me, a monthly live stream, check out my members only page. You can go to my YouTube homepage, click the join button, find out everything you need to see there. And hopefully it's tips like this that get you to sign up for the members. All right, so oftentimes most people spool up their rod and reel with whatever line they like to use, and then they basically use that for all of their fishing. They don't change their line. And I'm here to tell you that your line diameter is something that will make a huge difference. And I say line diameter because most people talk about the pound test. So you say 10-pound test, 12-pound test, 15-pound test. The reality is the line diameter is one of the biggest functions. The pound test gives you the breaking point. It tells you how strong the line is. But when you really sit down and compare line diameter, you're going to find out that one company's 10-pound test is much different in size versus other companies. And it's not simply a matter of, well, I want the smallest diameter. Generally speaking, the smaller the diameter, even if they're both, say, 10-pound test, you generally run into an easier breaking point because there's an easier way for that line to get broken if there's a micro nick in it or some very small mark versus the thicker line may have better overall abrasion resistance, even though it's a little bit thicker. There's a lot of things that go into it. The key here is that diameter is one of the things that I really like to look at because the diameter is what's creating drag in the water. And from that standpoint, it's really affecting the bait presentation. So, for example, I'm actually sitting down here. I'm going to change this reel out where I've got a small glide bait that I've been playing around with. This has 15-pound test on it. Now, I want to change this to 10-pound test because I really feel like the 15-pound test is overpowering my bait, meaning I'm getting the bait to create drag in the water and it's affecting the performance of the glide bait. So if I switch to say 10-pound test, I think I'm going to get more movement out of the bait, which generally helps generate those reaction strikes. So in this case, I'm going to take the 15-pound off and put 10 on. Now, the other aspect to this that you need to recognize is if you are going down or up in line size, you might want to change the rod that you're throwing it on as well. Meaning in this case, this is a 7.3 medium heavy fast action rod. I may actually want to go down to more of a moderate fast action rod if I'm going with the lighter line, because a lot of times what happens is when you do change the line, you also get different performance out of the rod. And from that standpoint, the rod can overpower the line. The last thing I want to do is take a glide bait out on the water where I'm already probably pushing the limits of using it on 10-pound test. If I'm throwing it on too stout of a rod, I'm not going to get the performance that I want. And at the same time, I have a much greater likelihood of breaking those fish off. So you really want to take into account the marriage between the line and your rod because every little change you make will affect the performance of the bait, which has an effect on your overall fishing. So you got to consider the line diameter as one of the most important things, and then the breaking point. I think oftentimes people are really just concerned with the poundage, but it's not necessarily always the case. For example, the Berkeley Trilene 100% fluorocarbon, which is the one that I really like to use, has a much stronger breaking point, in my opinion. It's much more abrasion resistant, but it is also a little bit thicker in diameter. So I generally will actually drop down a size to get better performance, knowing that I've also got good abrasion resistance and I'm probably not going to break off regardless. But you got to be aware of that too. You don't want to pick up a rod and say, hey, I have 8 or 10-pound test on here and think that you've got 15 or 17-pound test. So what a lot of people do is they'll mark their rod, they'll put a piece of tape on their rod blank or on their reel, and they'll be able to record what pound test is on that fishing pole. Now, another good tip, and I know a lot of you guys out there are watching it saying, well, I don't want to take a whole spool of line off just to switch. Well, you don't necessarily need to do that. You've got a couple of tricks to it. You can change the spools out on both a spinning and bait casting rod. Now, a lot of spinning reels, especially your high end ones, will actually come with an extra spool. So I'll generally have a 6 pound spool, an 8 pound spool, sometimes even a 10 pound spool sitting in my boat as an extra so that if I do want to make a quick change, I can just swap the spool out. It's a really easy thing to do. You can also do that with your bait cast reels. Generally, you don't get an extra spool with your bait cast reel, but you can buy an extra spool and then swap the spool out the same way you would do on a spinning reel. So that's a simple tip to keep you from spending the extra money on additional line because we all know how expensive your lines are. But more importantly, the takeaway from this, guys, is to recognize that if you're not getting the correct performance out of a bait, don't just say, hey, I'm going to put it away, pick up another bait. Think about also trying it on a different line test. The lighter you go, generally, the better performance you get. You know, if we were able to work all the baits on 20-pound line, we would do it. The reality is, most baits don't function that well on 20-pound tests. So for me, my standard line sizes are generally 6 pound. If I'm talking spinning rods, it's going to be a 10-pound braid to a 6 pound leader. If I'm talking bait casting rods, generally speaking, it's 10 pound, 15 pound, and potentially 17 pound. If I need to go heavier than 17 pound, generally I'm fishing it on braid. You know, it's like I'm flipping mats or throwing a frog. I really don't feel a need to go heavier than 17 pound fluorocarbon. But it's really important just to understand how line diameter affects the bait performance, how not all 10-pound test lines are the same across the board by all the companies. And at the same time, you also need to recognize the type of line too. We've talked a lot about that on the channel, but if you're throwing monofilament, fluorocarbon, braid, they all perform differently. They all perform differently on the same rod because the rod performs differently when you're talking about lines that have a lot of stretch or no stretch, and it all affects the performance of the bait. So in my case, I'm going to be downgrading to a lighter fluorocarbon line to see if that has a good positive impact on the bait performance. If I find that it doesn't change much, I might not use the bait that much. If I find that it makes a big difference, I know for future reference that bait needs to be worked on 10-pound fluorocarbon with whatever type of rod that I'm throwing it on. So hopefully this was helpful, guys. Sometimes it's the little details that make a big difference, and oftentimes they go overlooked by most anglers, and it really can have an impact on your performance. So thanks for watching. I appreciate all the support. If you enjoyed today's video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and stay tuned. We'll have a new video coming out tomorrow.